This is a coral reef. This is where all corals that we trade in the hobby originally started from. And this is what their journey looks like to get to us. They're brought up to the surface, thrown inside a box, loaded onto an airplane, and then they're sent to the United States. All of the corals that you've seen in other people's tanks, the fish store, and aquarium, they all came from the wild. So to understand why corals cost so much, we have to take a look at the three main places that corals come from. Okay, you might be saying to yourself, well, I know that the corals that I have been aquacultured, and I'm more specifically talking about the origin of corals. So the first one I want to get into is wild coral. Wild corals typically came from places like Indonesia and Malaysia. And to the south, they were also collected off the eastern side of Australia. If we go farther east, another place that corals were collected is Fiji. So what are wild corals? Wild corals are corals that were caught on a natural reef. They were brought up to the surface and then probably put into a holding system before they were sent off to various places in the world. And people that have been in the hobby for 20 or 30 years, when they talk about how cheap coral used to be, this is the main reason why. Because harvesting coral from a natural reef is virtually free. And you're really not paying them a large amount of money for the coral itself. You're paying more in shipping most of the time to get it to the United States. So I saw this post on Reddit, and the guy was saying that corals don't really cost that much on average, and people just over-exaggerate how much corals cost nowadays. And I believe he calculated that the average price was like somewhere between like $50 and $75. Now what this guy really didn't consider was the quantity of coral that you're going to get for $50. And that is what has drastically changed, where nowadays you're going to be buying a frag for like $50, where 30 years ago you would buy a mini colony for $50. And so the thing about wild caught coral is that it's being phased out. We've already seen places like Indonesia do bans and convert their system over into mariculture. And so that really sucks because there's a lot of species of coral that we're still getting from the wild today that we can't really propagate in captivity. Things like scolemia, lobophilia, trichophilia, these big LPS corals that grow really slow that, it'd take a decade to get to the size that we commonly see in the hobby. Today, there's a lot of regulations on the harvesting of wild coral. That's why these larger LPS corals are becoming so expensive, because it's the only source for a lot of them. Now, this next topic is similar to wild coral, and that's mariculture. Maricultured corals are similar to wild corals because they're grown in the ocean. The main difference is that they're not grown on a natural reef, they're actually grown on an artificial reef. Mariculture is mainly done overseas in places like Indonesia and Malaysia. Mariculture mainly started to lessen the environmental impact of harvesting corals from natural reefs. It's also a more economical way to grow coral because you're not relying on lighting that you would have to pay electricity for. You're not having to pay for things like salts and additives that you'd have to put into the water. And you're also not having to buy coral food. Even though they're saving money by not having to pay for electricity and these other things, there's one big difference between wild coral and mariculture coral, and that thing is time. People running mariculture operations now can no longer harvest coral whenever they want to. We have to take these corals and then grow them out, and that takes months. So because these corals are not being grown on a natural reef, you don't have things like fish that are cleaning the coral and cleaning up the algae around them. So people actually have to come out to these sites and inspect them and clean them and make sure that they're doing okay. Now, because of this increased time and human interaction that is required to grow these corals tend to be slightly more expensive than the wild counterparts. And because you're also having to pay for international shipping, that also increases the price. Now I'm going to talk about one last thing, and that's something that most people in the hobby are very familiar with, and that's aquaculture. Aquaculture corals tend to be the most expensive out of all of them. They've been grown in tanks with artificial lighting and artificial conditions. Somebody has to tend to these corals on a daily basis. They need to make sure that the salinity is okay, that the alkalinity is right, that the calcium's right, that the temperature's right. They're corals that completely rely on humans to keep them alive. And it's very expensive to do this on a large scale. You have electrical cost, you have food cost, you have equipment cost. You got to pay somebody to be there to watch these corals and make sure that they don't die. You no longer have to pay international shipping to get the coral, but the cost of growing coral in an artificial environment completely outweighs the cost of shipping. And you're also waiting for the corals to grow. So all these things together make aquaculture corals the most expensive route to go when you're talking about buying coral. This is why you see frags of aquaculture acropora sell for so much money, because there's so many cost factors involved with growing corals in an artificial environment. I hope that information kind of helped you understand where these corals are obtained from and some of the costs associated with growing them and propagating them. If you really think about it, the reason why corals cost so much is because the hobby's just expensive in general. Think about how much it cost you to set up your reef tank. Now times that by 100. That's how much it costs for these aquaculturists and wholesalers to set up their operation and maintain it. I could show you a spreadsheet on how much it actually costs to buy these corals overseas, but I feel like that would leave you with the wrong impression. Are international sellers selling coral for significantly cheaper than what you could buy them in the US market? Absolutely. But that's not the final picture. What I can't really show you is how much sites would cost. And if you don't know what a site is, it's basically a permit that you have to pay for to actually import these endangered species into different countries. You'd also have to pay for international shipping, customs duties, taxes, import licenses on a federal level or even possibly on your state level. And then you're having to pay for equipment and salt and water and electricity and food. All of this increases the coral's final price. And don't get me wrong, I'm not telling you all this stuff to make it seem like these businesses aren't making money. They are, but the profit margins really aren't that high. Don't see a $100 coral and feel like you're being scammed. The truth is, a lot of importers and aquaculturists endure the same costs that you do as a hobbyist, just on a larger scale. Most international and domestic wholesalers have a minimum amount of coral that you would need to buy from them. And if you took away all the red tape that was preventing the hobbyist from buying directly from a wholesaler, I believe that most hobbyists wouldn't. That's because these wholesalers want people to buy thousands of dollars of coral from them. And if you're like most hobbyists and you have a smaller tank, you just simply don't have the room to put all that coral. So I personally believe that we would still end up in the same situation where we have retailers that sell this to you in a smaller quantity for a little bit of a markup. Personally, I don't think enough people kind of think about this in this way, and that's that this is an endangered species that only grows in a very specific part of the world that is being shipped to you overnight, and for the most part, it's somewhat affordable. If you do want to save a little bit of money on coral, just buy from a local hobbyist. But there's nothing wrong with supporting your local fish store or an aquaculturist that you like what they're doing. They're not bad people, they're just trying to make a living off something that they love doing, and I really don't think there's anything wrong with that. I do sell coral, and I'm not really making this video to try to show myself out there. I more just wanted to make this video to help people understand how this whole system works. I've watched my fair share of coral videos, and I've never really watched a video where somebody kind of talked about how this whole system works. And so that's why I wanted to make this. I just wanted to kind of give you some insight. I didn't really want to make a tutorial on how to import coral. I just wanted to kind of talk about why corals cost so much, because I feel like that's a topic that a lot of people do talk about. But I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something. If you do want to check out my website, I'd appreciate that. But anyways, I'll talk to you guys later.